Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The Hopeful Majority. I'm your host, Manu. As you know, every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, we are dropping episodes and some fascinating conversations. The goal is always to have nuanced, productive conversations across lines of difference, to not advocate for ideologies, instead to advocate for a temperament. We're fighting outrage, building nuance, and it's the fall time. I hope you and your families are also enjoying your time. I hope you're able to get some rest. Today, I've got a very special guest. He's special to me personally, a dear mentor, but also in some ways, as I lovingly call him, the Dumbledore of politics. Today's introduction is going to be a little bit different. We're not going to go into a monologue before the interview. We're going to go right into the interview. This is going to be a little bit more like those presidential conversations with candidates, because I want you to go right into the conversation. The guest for today is David Gergen. Now, some of you may know David, some of you might not. As David describes himself, he's one of the most interesting people that I know in our politics, somebody that has a lot of wisdom. He served in 4 different presidential White Houses, from Nixon to Ford to Clinton to Reagan. I can't even say those all in order. He's got so much to offer us. And I'll say admittedly beforehand that, yes, he talks about his ideology. He's more on the left side. He talks about, at least today he believes a little bit more in progressive values. And also the recording's a little blurry. The audio's a little hard to hear, but the gem of advice and input that he has is, I think, especially important in today's moment. He talks about something that I think is more important than party ideology. He talks about character. He talks about virtues. He talks about the value that he sees in presidents like John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, why out of the 4 presidents he worked in the White House, he loved and believed in Ronald Reagan, not necessarily from an ideological standpoint, but from the way that he led the country. And then he also talks about a current contemporary politician, Wes Moore, who's on the Democrat side. This is a conversation about national service. It's about youth. It's about leadership. He talks about age. We get into President Biden. We get into the 2024 election. And if I were you, the way that I would approach this conversation, if I could offer just 2 very small pieces of input, is one is I would look past the ideology and focus on the character and the virtues that he's pushing, because I think those are virtues that we can all see. And secondarily is I would see him as somebody that has nothing to gain other than to simply pass down input and advice. And this is just something I would say personally about him. You know, there's sometimes people that you come across in your life, and especially me as somebody that's younger, that looks at mentors, and somebody that comes across your life that cares about the next generation. And David has written this book, Hearts Touched with Fire. If you're on Spotify and Apple, you can't see it, but I'm holding it up, where he's somebody that I've learned so much from. And I think we have a lot to learn from history. We've got a lot to learn from the wisdom of people that have come before us. And I hope that you take from this conversation things that might be relevant to your life. And he's got advice on resilience and change. So with all of that, I know that was a little rambly, but the reason I was a little rambly was because it's just hard to introduce somebody that has had such an impact both on my life and somebody that has shaped American politics for literally decades. And with that, let's get into the conversation with David Gergen. David Gergen, welcome to the Hopeful Majority, sir.
Hello, Manu. Good to see you again.
It is good to see you. I was just going to say that you and I have obviously, you've been incredibly gracious with your time, and I've learned a lot from you. And as I've told you affectionately, I've called you before the Dumbledore of American politics. And I think, boy, we certainly need your wisdom right now.
Well, we need some stability. That's also true.
We need lots of stability. And David, is where I want to take this conversation first is, as I was telling you, as we were getting on this conversation, we've had recently a lot of presidential candidates on. We've had political leaders, intellectuals. And given the fact that, you know, you've served in 4 different White Houses, you've written this book, Hearts Touched with Fire,
Yes.
which is focused on young people. I just want to start off very broad and ask you, what is your perspective on where we are in American politics today? And what do you think is our way out of what many see as a very exhaustive doom loop?
Manu, as you know, we're very much on the front end of marking or celebrating. Celebrating is probably the wrong word. but saluting Jack Kennedy, and his 60th assassination date is coming up on the 22nd of November, so it's just a few days away from now. And as a result of that, I've been reading back up on Kennedy again and his presidency and what lessons he has for leadership. What's really been striking to me is that there are similarities to the way we got into this mess with other presidents, and including Kennedy early on. And it's easy to make mistakes and let things pile up and have sort of have a cascading effect. What's really hard and what's different is that this is just a different time and a different place where the culture is different. Our culture in earlier times was always we had huge differences, but especially in the early days of the Republic, there were huge differences among the players. But as historians have written, in the earlier days, generally political leaders thought that at the end of the day, after all the arguments, that they had to compose their differences and they had to sort of find a middle ground of some sort. And that they were sometimes bloody getting there, but that was really essential in order to restore stability and the safety of the democracy. And what I think this time around is we just don't see the kind of restraints that we need. We don't see the kind of guardrails that we need in order to get back on track. I don't think there's any obvious answer right now.
What's interesting, David, is you talk about, getting the train back on the tracks. You said this really insightful thing to me once, which is that all of the presidents, prior to Ford had served in World War II in some way.
Right.
You'd mentioned John F. Kennedy, you'd mentioned this generation of people that had been in the military. You talk about George H.W. Bush.
Right.
What do you think differentiated the presidents of the past from the presidents of today?
Well, I think one of the biggest differences is this military service. We had 7 presidents starting and a new young generation coming into power in 1961 when John Kennedy became president. And he was the first of the military presidents, people who wore an active duty uniform. I mean, Eisenhower obviously had a huge, he was a huge general earlier than that. But but Kennedy kicked off with the young generation of leaders, and they were all every single one of the first 7 presidents from Kennedy on through George H.W. Bush. All 7 of those presidents wore a military uniform. 6 of them were in the war itself. One, Jimmy Carter, was too young to serve. He was in the Naval Academy as the war ended, but he went on to serve honorably in the Naval and in the Navy. And so there's a code of honor that goes with being in the military. There's also a discipline. There's an expectation that this is going to be you belong to this community, and therefore you ought to observe certain kind of standards. And that period of time when World War II presidents was in fact one of the high points of American presidency. It was very well done. And that generation, those 7 presidents, what they left behind was a magnificent legacy, and that is America was the strongest nation since the days of ancient Rome in terms of political, military, economic, and cultural influence. We were a powerhouse. That's not true. With that sort of period sort of came dwindling to an end, and we moved into the modern phase. And what we now see, Manu, just take one more second. What we now see we've had 5 presidents in a row, none of whom has served in a military uniform. There was one, and give him credit for this, George W. Bush was in the Guard. But there's something different about defending the great state of Texas from the state of Oklahoma. is the way we ought to judge our presidents. And and I do think there's not a sense of collective responsibility.
So
today.
On this phrase of collective responsibility, I mean, I'm sure some people are listening to this, and I And I know that they're not thinking, well, what David's saying is every president should serve in the military, but I think there's a deeper message there, which is that what you're essentially saying is that these presidents had a commitment to something bigger than themselves.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
how do you think we can inculcate that sense of service? And why do you think that's missing from the people today?
Well, I've become a great champion of, along with a number of other people, for national service. A project that would tells people, in effect, or sets a standard for the culture, and that is, we tell young people coming out of high school, that you have a choice. You can go on to college or go on to work. But what we would like to ask of you is that somewhere along the way, when you're young, you give a year back to the country. And in that year of service, you also begin to reduce your college debt, or erase your college debt. But you live with and work with people who are not like you, who didn't come up with the same zip code, and don't come out of the elite. You got a much better mixture, and I think that would serve us well. I would note, Manu, people have talked about national service for a long time, all the way back to Bill Buckley, the conservative, who argued it ought to be mandatory. Everybody ought to be required to spend a year, and he was conservative.
Yeah.
But I think that's just not in the cards to have everybody do it on a mandatory basis, nor do I think it should be early on. But what we do know is that there are now some experiments going on both coasts, and you spend a lot of time in the West, and Gavin Newsom is a real proponent of national service. He started small in California, but there are now as many 10,000 people in California who are covered by AmeriCorps, which is one of the chief components of national service. So on the West Coast, we have a significant effort underway. And by the way, Newsom is reaching out to other governors. There are conversations going on with other governors about whether they might pick up some of this. On the other coast, on the East Coast, where I live, hearts are on fire again, this time for this young man named Wes Moore, who is, I think, one of the most promising political figures I've met in the last 25 years.
Wes Moore.
Yeah, Wes Moore. I don't know whether I think probably a lot of your viewers and listeners won't know anything about Wes Moore, which is fine. They will.
Well, that's why you're here.
Well, one day, let me tell you a story, because I think it's one of the I'm a big fan of Wes Moore.
Okay. We'll have to bring him on.
You do. I guarantee you'll have a terrific program, because he's extremely thoughtful. And Wes is Black. He grew up in poverty. His dad disappeared very early. His mom was a single mom. And Wes, in his very early days, was rambunctious and defiant and angry at what had happened to him in life. And he got very involved in gang kind of effort. And he was in handcuffs by the age of 12. And it looked like he was going to spend his life in prison. And his mom to sort of did a Hail Mary with him and said, "You got to go to a military academy," which he did. He went to the Valley Forge Military Academy in Pennsylvania. And that changed his life. At first, he was rebellious against it. He didn't like all the requirements, in the sense of you belong. There's this authority you will have to listen to. He didn't like military sort of life. He tried to escape. He was brought back several times, and eventually, he came around to it just through his life and in a few years. And he then went on and got himself into Johns Hopkins to get an education, which is a terrific school, as you know. And at Johns Hopkins, he got a Rhodes Scholarship. Right. And with that, he was launched. And he went and worked some in private equity. Didn't like the equity, didn't like the private sector, but eventually got over and got a White House fellowship, which was very prestigious, and gave him another year. It's a grand year of national service for somebody. And eventually, Manu, he wound up being recruited by the Robin Hood program in New York City. Robin Hood is the largest anti-poverty nonprofit in the city, and he was hired by them to be the CEO, and ran that for like 7 years. And during that time, I know you need to move on, but just to finish this off. Toward the end of that time, he was approached by his friends who said, Wes, you really ought to run for public office. And he had never run for anything. And he said, okay, I'll give it a try. And then he went out into the Maryland primary first a couple of years ago. And in a heavy field, I think there were 10 people, including former CEO of the Democratic Party. And it would look like he started out like 2% in the poll.
And he climbed his way up.
He climbed his way up, and he wound up winning it, swept it by 18-20%. And then in the general election, he swept that by 18-20%. And now he's governor.
Yeah.
And last sentence.
Yeah.
He has two objectives that he outlined in his inaugural address. The first is to address childhood poverty, because he thinks that's the link to so much else. The second, national service. He'd like to try and make that central to his administration. And he's just launched a program in Maryland with the legislature raising money for exactly that is. And that is to tell high school students coming out, we'd like to develop an option for you. If you would like, you can come and join service. And you do that for a year, and you're going to have all sorts of other benefits.
Well, what's particularly powerful about that story, and I actually don't want to move off of Wes, David, because I think there's something interesting you're saying here. And obviously we have listeners from the left, the right. We've had candidates on from the left, the right. But I think you're making a deeper point, which is not so much about his politics, but about his character. Could you outline and use Wes as a character for what you specifically see in somebody like him, irrespective of party, that we can learn from to assess other candidates? Because you've served 4 presidents, so you have an understanding of leadership.
Yeah, let me just add one coda to what I was just saying in terms of his life. One thing that I left out that became very important for me, and very important in thinking about him as a Democrat, activist Democrat. This is a guy who volunteered and signed up with the 82nd Airborne. He was parachuting into warfare. He was a captain, and he stayed in, I think he was in 3 years or something like that. He put his life on the line for the country, and he's a progressive. I don't think there's a much better combination than that, and the values that they represent on both sides are quite important. I think there is a real sense that character matters, that honesty matters, that a willingness and empathy for the other guy matters. That if we're going to be serious about getting ourselves out of this jam, we've got to do it in a way that's going to be respectful. I think you and I are probably well over on the left side. We've got to be willing to reach out and find people and find there are elements that I think are already out there that we could do more together with.
Yeah. Well, I would say that I'm not necessarily politically that left or right these days. Honestly, frankly, I'll tell you, David, I think most people my age are just confused about what's going on. I would describe myself the way that I think a lot of people describe themselves, which is just like politically homeless. And I want to run something by you. Okay. So you've talked about leadership. You've talked about somebody like Wes as somebody that you see as a potential role model, irrespective of party.
Right.
The question I have for you is, a lot of people my age have thrown around questions around age as well. And it's something that's come around President Biden's candidacy.
Yeah.
And one of the most interesting things I saw from you, the humility you had, man, when I saw you talk to a conference last year in New York when we first met, you talked about age, and you talked about, I think, frankly, you just said something like, and I want you to talk about this a little bit. You said the boomers need to get off the pot, and it's time for, the next generation to step in. Could you speak to a little bit of that and what you think about age and the role it plays in our politics right now?
Well, I think it plays a central role in our politics right now. We have a generation that by normal standards would already have started leaving the stage by now, and there a lot of the members of the old generation don't want to leave. They're clinging to power. They're holding on to the curtains in the Oval Office, and it's apparent that. I think if you spend any time around someone in his late 70s, early 80s, I'm 81 years old, and it would be crazy for me to try to go out and be a cabinet officer right now, or be a chief of staff to a president. I've been approached on both over time, and because I'm just not as quick on my feet, but I'm a little more cautious. And I think you require in the presidency in particular a certain boldness and a certain vision of capacity for vision and lifting people up, which you need. At the same time, you can be anchored by your principles and by your sense of character and honesty. Which so you get a nice balance in life. But we're entering one of the most complex periods of time in our nation's history. And we're in a country now and in a culture that changes overnight. Things are evolving so quickly. I mean, 3 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, who the hell would ever have imagined we'd have the kind of brutal warfare that's going on now in the Middle East? It looked like we were coming out the other direction. Things were settling down. The Biden administration itself, proclaimed it just shortly before the warfare broke out, how we were moving into this quieter period and more productive period with the Saudis and with others in the Middle East. So I think we need individuals who are really, really dedicated and are empathic, but also are adaptive, who can adapt quickly to the changing circumstances. And my sense is that people in their 70s and 80s have a harder time doing that.
Well, I'll tell you one thing, David, which is the reason why I actually wanted to bring you on. And this is what I've deeply, deeply appreciated about our relationship. We've had 4 or 5 conversations and the knowledge I've took from you. And I think there's something about this intergenerational concept where you take the curiosity and energy of younger people and you take the wisdom and experience of older folks, and that creates a very potent combination.
I agree totally with that.
There was this quote that I mentioned to you to just elucidate the respect for our relationship. RFK once said, a year after JFK's death in South Africa, he said, youth is not a time of life, it's a stage of mind. And the fact is that there's a curiosity that's required. So I've got to ask you a hard question.
Sure.
Should President Biden be running in 2024?
I have enormous respect for President Biden. I think he has been a very decent president. He's a man of decency. I think he was better prepared to be president than almost anybody we've had in recent years. And it's helped work to his advantage on some of the domestic stuff, and indeed on some of the foreign policy. Having said that, I don't think we should elect people based on their past. I think we should elect them based on what their potential is for the future. And I think it's much less clear that he could run a sustainable 4 years. And given the demands of the office, I think we would be, and voters are showing that they get this. A lot of voters out there, they understand that, that when you get older, things change. I mean, they don't always change, by the way, because I got, just as I was turning 80, a friend of mine said, you got to remember, David, that 60 is the old 50. We all agree on that. and 70 is the old 60. We all agree on that. But 80 is still 80.
80 is still the 80. Well, why is that?
It has something to do with our genes, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think we just need Elon Musk's neural link a little bit faster, and maybe it'll juice up folks' brains. So then I guess the question then becomes, Biden is I think he's 80, right? He's 81.
Yes, he's 81.
He's 81. So he's your age.
And, that's worse.
And so,
judging from my own experience, Joe, you ought to think about it twice.
So then from more of a practical matter, I know that a lot of the conservatives listening to the show are going to be really happy to hear it. They're going to say, David said Biden should think twice. And I know a lot of liberal people on the show are going to say, yeah, I can see age is a real issue. That poll just came out where it showed Biden, down in 5 different battleground states compared to President Trump. The natural question becomes, what would your advice to the Democratic Party be, given that's where you sort of see yourself politically? given the short timeline? What's the practical implication of what you're saying?
Let me be very clear. I think it's not only Biden who would be wise to leave the stage, but cut Trump. And Trump is completely off the rails in so many different ways. And I see no prospect at this point of him changing, becoming a really effective 82-year-old leader. I just don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, so you've got this age issue on both sides.
It does show not, and I think it's prejudicial to say, well, one is when they're both, when Biden's a little older, but nonetheless, Trump is sometimes showing the behavior of a 5-year-old.
Yeah,
and so whatever. What was your question now?
Well, then the question is what would your advice be to the Democratic Party? What's the practical implication of your input?
I think there was a real chance they were going to get this done before the events of a few days ago with the new elections. That gives the elections and how the abortion issue played out, and how people showed how many voters in red states. Looked like a place like Kentucky, a really good governor, Andy Beshear, was elected there, but he's a blue guy in a red state, and there are not many people that can do that kind of thing well. And I think he's one of them. But my advice would be, if you're in the Democratic Party right now, is to keep the window open for nominating somebody other than Joe Biden. At the very least, what you want is and I think very, very importantly now, that in effect people ought to know when they nominate Biden, and when they nominate the successor, that person is going to become president of the United States. The chances are very, very high. The thing that's comparable to me, and I don't want to go too far in this analogy, but I remember so well when Nixon was president, and Agnew they were talking to Agnew, and what it became apparent was, as Agnew was being selected as vice president, that then in fact Nixon was choosing a president, and that's what the Democratic Party told Nixon: you need to go with somebody that we can trust, and that's how Jerry Ford came onto to the grounds.
Right.
So I don't see at this point. It's very difficult for any other Democratic candidate to wage a campaign, because it sounds like you're undercutting your own party. So that a Gavin Newsom or a Whitmer or maybe even a Wes Moore, these people are unable to communicate because it looks like they're throwing over. They're traitors to the cause. That's why I think the real burden is on Biden himself and on Trump,
to create that pathway.
Yeah.
And I had Vivek Ramaswamy on a couple of weeks ago, and even on the Republican side, it's the same argument. When we're recording this, the GOP debate was just yesterday night, and it almost feels like a silver medal contest, and there's no real pathway. I've got one last question then around experience and age for you. A lot of people in my generation have thrown around the idea of term limits on members of Congress, especially around, the unfortunate passing of Senator Dianne Feinstein. We see this with somebody like Chuck Grassley. We've got somebody like Senator Mitch McConnell. And to a younger person, it seems like, folks are holding on to power for what might seem like too long. Do you have thoughts around things like term limits or ways to potentially balance that?
Well, it's a good question. Historically, I have been against term limits because it seems to me they're anti-democratic, and the country should be allowed to choose, have a full choice. On the other hand, I also think if people are going to clog up the system, in effect, and so that so many of the younger generation can't even get into a national campaign until they're 50 years old or they're older, then and especially the Supreme Court. It does seem to me that there is what we know is the culture. People get into when they're young, they have one set of values, and they turn older, they tend to be more conservative values. But I think the Supreme Court is a clear example of where we've been better off had there been term limits.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, so I want to now shift this conversation, the remaining 10 minutes we've got, to something
Sure.
totally different from politics, which is your
Okay.
life, which is what I find both inspiring and something I know that you don't like to talk too much about. But I wanna mention the fact that, for example, you served in the Navy, you served in 4 different White House administrations. I was just talking to my friend and producer about different questions to ask you, and one of the questions that immediately comes to mind is you had 4 different administrations. Did you have a favorite? And I'm not, and I know how difficult that question is because I know the jobs were very different, the administrations were very different, but was there a particular president or an administration that you particularly appreciated working for?
Well, let me just say that I got into politics in North Carolina, my home state, and that was in the late '50s, early '60s. And I got very involved in civil rights there, which was as you know, contentious issue of the time. And as a result of that, I was in civil rights. I got to know and work with someone named Terry Sanford, who was our young Jack Kennedy. He was governor of the state. And in my time working with him and for his administration, frankly, was the most satisfying of any political job I've had, because it was at the state level, and you could see the people, you could talk to people. It wasn't all sort of done, remotely through social media or anything like that. It was really honest to God. And we had a measure of peace and under Terry, and progress that made a big difference. It was so-called New South, and I've had presidents since that I've been
Well,
honored to.
actually, there's something I want to hold on there that you just said. You went to my question where about presidents, and you talked about a local state office, right, or a governor.
Yes,
And one of the things we often hear is the power of local politics, right?
yes,
When given how national everything is, could you speak a little bit to why you think it's important to do local?
sure.
Yeah.
I think it's vital that people spend some time at the local level, because that's where the real action is these days. With so much paralysis in Washington, I tell young people, I used to tell young people, go to Washington and spend 2 or 3 years, really get to know how the country works. Well, I don't tell people that anymore. I
Mm.
said, if you got a particularly special job, and you have a chance to work for somebody who's really special, or you have a chance to work on an issue that's really special to you, such as climate, or such as race, or poverty, and all the other issues, diversity, and the issues we think about. But I do think it helps you a lot to get grounded in the values and how people not like you, people who run for office, tend to have fancy degrees. And at some level, you've got to get beyond your fancy degrees to sort of how do regular folks live?
Mm.
Well, how do they think about it? How is life if you're in a working class life situation, and you got a lot of promise, but you got all these bills that pile up, and then you feel your whole generation is being threatened by the dumb, stupid answers that are coming out of Washington.
Uh-huh.
So I do think get in there and get it. The important thing, Manu, is get in the arena. As Teddy Roosevelt, used to say, the man in the arena speech. It's not the spectator on the sidelines who matters. It's the person who's in the arena.
Mm.
And I encourage people to do that. Go spend a year or two. There's a big piece in the Wall Street Journal these last few days about what's going on in corporate America, and the thrust of the piece is that as employers are looking for new employees, they're finding more and more that people who have been veterans, military veterans, tend to make good employees. They tend to make better employees. They don't whine. They get down to work.
They know how to get stuff done.
They got to get stuff
They got
done.
bigger things to worry about,
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not just plugging the military service. I also think just getting out there and working.
Yeah, do something.
Do something. Get in the hospital situation. Be a first responder on with the storms. That's why President Biden just started a conservation corps as a form of service. I think it's really, really important to know how other people live. I went to 2 prestigious schools coming up, as I think you know. One, I went to Yale as an undergraduate, and I loved it there. And then I went to the Harvard Law School. So I worked in these two sort of ivory tower things. And then I got in the Navy and started working with guys who barely finished the 12th grade. And it was such a difference. But it really helped me understand, get with the real world, get and understand the folks. That's the way you're going to make a difference. You can speak for and you give voice for. I mean, that's what Gandhi, let's take it on a larger frame. What was Gandhi all about? How did he launch his career? He went to South Africa as a lawyer and thought he was going to be a lawyer. And then he was discriminated against in South Africa, which really pissed him off. But he basically rebelled and was called back to India. And what did he do when he got back to India? He didn't give a speech. He didn't go out and talk to people. He didn't go out and tell people what to do and how to do it. He went around the country asking questions and sleeping third and fourth class cars. And he listened to the voices of the people of India. And then a year into that, he started talking himself. He started urging people to move forward. He paid his dues. He thought about it, and he understood. And one of the things I think we haven't even really dealt with, Manu, is I think women in America are listening better than the men are, and I think they're paying attention to what's needed better than men are. And what we find right now is that a lot of women are moving into leadership roles, which I think is terrific. But we should have a concern that something is not right among younger men right now, especially black men. It's tough being a black man in this country right now, and we need to be focusing on what are we going to. The older generation, of which I'm a part, ought to be doing all we can to help people prepare for leadership of the country.
Yeah, I realize I let you off the hook about who your favorite president was amongst the four that you served, but I think,
I'll just straight up, I wasn't as conservative as he was, but I look back now with a lot of nostalgia for Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, I just think he looks better with time.
Why is that?
Yeah, well, I think that because some of the presidents we've seen since then just don't match up. They haven't. They look like they're going to be shiny new models, and it didn't quite work out that way.
Well, I want to go back to actually the seriousness of your answer, which is thinking through the importance of service and thinking about being the person in the arena. There's two last questions I have for you. One is about resilience, and the second one is about change.
Okay.
And I was just thinking about this as you were talking, which is I haven't been doing this work for that long, but it is hard. It's hard to sustain. It requires a lot of barbs and arrows. One thing I've noticed with anything public is that you're almost guaranteed to piss somebody off someday, almost every day. Yep. What is your advice to somebody pursuing a career in service or in public office, whether it's a presidential candidate currently or somebody young, about staying resilient?
Well, let me just, I should ask Coda again. I would also say that Bill Clinton was, we had a very nice relationship. I enjoyed those.
For the record, President Clinton, Mr. Gergen said he still has a good relationship with you.
Listen, he wrote a beautiful letter for me when I was retired, as I moved toward retirement here at the Kennedy School. Listen, I think more and more we ought to appreciate the importance of studying the classics and being schooled in history and understanding how often there are similarities, parallels, but appreciating the differences as well. And it's a growing concern to me, at least. I'm sure not to necessarily others, but it's a growing concern that the humanities departments are being downgraded in universities, and there's less emphasis, much more emphasis on STEM teaching and research. And there's no question STEM is really quite important, but that doesn't diminish the importance of the humanities. And an appreciation right now, I now have more time to read, and I've been reading about the Stoics.
Right. Right.
I didn't understand much about Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus or people like that.
Yeah.
And
meditations.
Meditations. I've been found it's really, very interesting. One day, I'll tell you a quick story. I was traveling with President Clinton. I was working for him at that time on Air Force One, and we got onto the plane in front of the plane there, and he was walking back through the aisle, he came across Ted Koppel of ABC News, and Koppel was deep into a book. And Clinton said to Koppel, "What are you reading, Ted?" And he said, "I'm reading Meditations by Marcus Aurelius." And Clinton said, "You are?" Clinton said, "I love that book. I read it every year. I read it anew." And Koppel said, "So do I." So do I. And they were two of the wiser people in their generations.
Yeah, yeah. It's fascinating, and this is one of many stories that you've told me. And what I'm sure somebody that's listening to this can appreciate is whether or not they agree with your politics, whether or not they agree with the folks you like. The fact is you're talking about character, right? Whether it's Reagan, Clinton, you're talking about service. These things exist above our politics. And my last question for you is about change.
Yes.
You're somebody that's spanned generations, administrations. You've seen so much rapid technological change, and our society, way long after we're gone, is going to continue going through change, and change is only getting more rapid.
Right.
What's your advice to people on adapting to change? Because change can be very scary, and I think it produces calls for a lot of dark politics.
Yeah.
What's your advice on dealing and adapting to change?
Well, among other things, I wouldn't say he's a role model, but I would argue that people ought to go back and read Machiavelli. 500 years ago, he was arguing change is very, very hard. And that is because there are some people who live very, very well with a system that other people, that treats other people horribly. But you want to help these people and they normally, the ones who are getting hurt, would normally rally against this existing situation. But the truth is that people who are suffering from the lack of change, they're scared themselves of changing because it may get worse. And so we have right now a situation where the country is sort of stuck in leadership situations where we're not quite sure where to go and we don't know who to look to. Oh, I have a question before we leave to you.
Yeah.
Or in your desk, you've got all these books piled up. It looks like they're books about presidents. You got, as well as political leaders. You've got King and you've got Grant, as well as Jefferson. But between the King and the Grant book, Martin Luther King and Ulysses S. Grant, which is a better book and who was a better leader?
I appreciate that question. For everybody listening that can't watch this, I've got a stack of books, and as people know, this is a very small stack of many other books I've got. I'll answer the question the way you would answer a question, which is rather than giving you the simple one is better than the other. There's value in both. With Grant, you know what was so interesting, David, that I learned, and the reason why I wanted to read that book was because Grant was actually a very normal person who was overlooked throughout his career, and went from being somebody that was a severe alcoholic to suddenly the head of the Union Army in over 5 years. And he is an example to me of somebody that demonstrates that service is not meant for somebody that is just going to the best schools or somebody that looks the best or seems the most promising. That it's for everybody, and everybody has the opportunity. It's about whether or not you're willing to take it. And what's so interesting about Dr. King, what I liked about his book, and I actually had on Jonathan I, who wrote this book, and it's the most recent biography of King, is King understood human nature better than I think most people do.
I agree.
And what I mean by human nature is that he understood that humans are arrogant, humans are selfish, humans also have a capacity to love. And you can't create change without speaking to both the darker angels of human nature and the better angels.
Totally agree. And,
so I like them both.
One of the best quotes from King is that you don't have to be rich to serve. All of us can serve. It's a really good statement on his part. And so much. I'm in the midst of reading the King book now. I haven't touched Grant, but I got to Churchill before, and I got waylaid by Churchill.
Andrew Roberts. Have you read
Andrew Roberts? Yes, Andrew Roberts. 800 pages.
800 pages, and I learned you talking to him.
Yeah. Talk to him, and he's got the new film that's coming out called Napoleon.
Yes,
which is just coming out by around Thanksgiving. Andrew Roberts was that's created based on Andrew Roberts' book about
It
Napoleon.
is, and I have Napoleon's book as well. You should tell Andrew to join the show. I
I
learned
will.
the other thing I learned from the Churchill book. I know you got to run soon, but the other thing I learned from the Churchill book is not only that he was an interesting and good leader meant for his time, but do you know how many cigars he consumed by the end of his life? 896,000.
As I read the story, he did have a cigarette or a cigar in his mouth almost the whole time,
He
but he
did.
didn't actually smoke it.
No, he huffed it.
Like his
but-
drinking.
Well, he woke up with brandy. In the afternoon he had a glass of wine, and
Yeah.
for dinner he had some more brandy, and throughout the entire experience he had a cigar.
Yeah.
And he lived to 95.
He was one of the most remarkable figures in history.
What an indomitable spirit.
Yeah, the Roberts book, and Andrew Roberts is one of the better writers that I've seen too. I'm really pleased about that.
Well, last thing I've got for you, because this is making me a little sentimental to think about legacy and the future. Again, I've learned a lot from our relationship. I don't take it for granted, and I hope people took away something, nuggets of wisdom from this conversation. I wasn't going to ask you this question, but this is a question that I actually ask everybody before they leave. It's the last question on every episode, and it's asked to everyone. And the show is called The Hopeful Majority, and the idea behind the hopeful majority, the hope, is that I think to get hope, you have to have a really good answer to the question why. Why do you do what you do? Why do you, the deep sort of purpose that gives us the ability to put one foot ahead of the other, especially in times of tragedy. And so I want to ask you this question of why. Why do you do and have lived the life of service that you've given to this country?
Well, I listen, I feel very grateful for the life I've had, and I've been treated very well by the world and by my friends in particular. I find it increasingly a sense of calling, and it's a lot easier, frankly, to decide what you don't want to do than decide what you do want to do. And I tried a number of things early on in life, many of which I didn't really like. I mean, I went to Wall Street and stayed there for a short while, and I said, I don't think so. So I do think, and that's why Hearts Touched with Fire. It's people who fought that the title of that my book, Hearts Touched with Fire, comes from Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who was came from a prominent family in Boston, was at Harvard as an undergraduate when Lincoln issued a call for volunteers to go. It was the first call for volunteers in the Civil War, and Oliver Wendell Holmes could have sold his ticket, which is what many people did, including his father, had done. But he decided to volunteer. And he was in the war itself. He was wounded grievously on 3 occasions and left for dead the last time out. So it looked like he'd never make it. But miraculously, he survived. And 20 years after the war was over, the Civil War was over, he gave a talk on Memorial Day and talked about what his generation had been through earlier. And he said, that people came through the Civil War. It was a blessing in many ways. That their hearts were touched with fire. Experience of the war. I want to tell you one last thing. We cannot leave this without recognizing that many of these leaders also had a sense of humor. And I found that from Reagan to Clinton. But I love Roosevelt on that. I mean, I'm sorry, Churchill on that. There was this story that I enjoyed. Is George Bernard Shaw had a play that he had produced, and he sent a note to Churchill saying, "Here are two tickets to my play for you, and to bring a friend if you have one." And Churchill wrote back, "George, I will try to get to the second night of your play if there is one."
The other humor story that I remember you telling me was the one with John F. Kennedy and cigars.
Oh yes.
You want to? Could you close us off with telling that story too?
Well,
That was funny.
I'll shorten it some. When Kennedy was president, he had his top press officer was a very funny guy, an interesting person named Pierre Salinger. And Salinger, after Kennedy died, and Salinger started going around the country giving lectures, and I happened to be with him on a number of occasions. We were on the same stage together, talking about things, and he loved to tell the story that, as press secretary, that he was in his office right off the Oval Office. At 11 o'clock one morning, the phone rang. It was the president saying, "Pierre, come in here. I need to talk to you." So Salinger goes into the Oval Office, and there's the president alone. And the president says, "Pierre, I know you're good. You're a good man, and I need a favor." "And what's that, Mr. President?" "Well, Pierre, I need you to get me some of Havana's finest cigars." "Mr. President, those cigars are really hard to come by these days. I just don't see how I can do that, Pierre. You're a good man. I know you can get it done. See you later." Next morning, 11 o'clock, phone rings. "Pierre, come in here and talk to me." Walks in. "Pierre, did you get those cigars?" "Yes, sir, Mr. President. I got all 1,000. I got 1,000, and they're right here. I know you're a good man, Pierre." Noon sharp, Kennedy goes on national television to declare a trade embargo against Cuba.
It's true. Humor gives you a sense of putting everything into perspective.
Exactly.
David, thank you so much for coming on the show. I always learn a lot from our conversations, and I appreciate you taking the time.
I enjoyed it, and I'm really glad you've joined you're in the arena. Stay there. We need you to do that.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you.
Okay, you take good care.
Well, thank you so much to David for coming on to that conversation. I know that the audio is a little tough and the video is a little tough, but I know the ideas were there. And that's what matters, is it's ideas and virtue and character over party. This conversation was something that spanned, I think, politicians and Joe Biden, and it spanned people like Ronald Reagan, and it touched on the current moment we're in today. And we talk about polarization and how young people get involved. I hope you took something from that conversation. Remember, every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, we come at you. Remember, if you're on Spotify and Apple, review the podcast. If you're on YouTube, leave a like, subscribe. We're building this majority together because, as David said, there's a hopeful majority of people out there that believe in a better temperament and believe in a better tomorrow. So let's build that together. I'll see you next week.